I would never think that my strange hobby may be dangerous, and in fact, even now, when I have a good reason to fear for my life, I'm not sure that I won't do it again. Apparently, for the last time, I'll go through it in order, so you know what I mean. I am a freelance designer. I live in a one-room apartment in Brooklyn, New York. This apartment is mine. So the little money I get for all sorts of business cards, brochures, and other flyers, I spend only on the most basic food. I have no friends, no girlfriend, and I spend all my time on the internet. My only hobby, if you can call it a hobby, is walking around Google Street View or panoramas, imagining that I am actually visiting this or that place. I make up a legend for each such walk. For example, I travel with my girlfriend, go to the restaurant, eat rabbit stew with white wine. At this moment, I eat instant noodles. Then we walk through a flea market where we buy, for example, an old alarm clock, a rare book, or a vintage cup holder. And then we go to the hotel to have a rest. This hobby may be strange, but what makes it even stranger is my compulsive disorder. I get to my destination and back the same way, using Street View. Perhaps in this way, the imitation of travel becomes more complete, or something. You'll probably think I'm a little weird, but damn it, I like this activity in my own way. Anyway, I once traveled through Alaska, this time alone, without a girlfriend. Unlike neighboring Canada, where every footpath was filmed, in Alaska, Google took pictures only of the main roads, which, however, are of little interest, but some panoramas of the service users are incredibly beautiful and atmospheric. Obviously, people have tried their best, choosing the most favorable location and waiting for the right lighting. As you probably know, Google has an algorithm that blurs faces on their panoramas. It's because of complaints about privacy violations. But in my opinion, nobody needs your faces. Though on the panoramas made by users of the service, the faces are almost never blurred. That's an important point, and you'll soon understand why. So, I found a wonderful spot not far from Haines Village, from the high rocky ridge, with knotty roots of pine trees clinging to it. One can enjoy a breathtaking view of the forest. It is stretched to the horizon. The whimsically shaped clouds are frozen above it, and soft northern sunlight is laid on the shiny surface of the distant lakes. I admired the panorama for a long time, looking at the details. Then, I remembered that I had promised to send the sketch, which was still unfinished. A few hours later, the work was done and sent to the customer. The night was slowly descending on the city, and after rubbing my eyes, I got up from the computer desk and got ready for bed, took a shower, ate dinner, and with a cup of hot tea, again sat down at the computer. I decided to enjoy the panorama I had liked one more time before going to bed. I was a bit taken back when I got to Google Maps. The panorama was different from what I had seen before during the day. It was different. It looked pale. The light turned yellow-gray, and the shadows seemed harsher. The landscape no longer seemed welcoming and peaceful. It was frightening. It was as if something sinister was to come out of the thicket. Though, of course, that was ridiculous, because the picture was static, and if anyone did come out of the thicket, it would be my not-so-rich imagination. I sat and slowly rotated the panorama, when suddenly, something made me stop. There was actually someone standing behind a tree, deep in the woods. This someone hadn't been there an hour ago. I was absolutely sure of it. I couldn't believe what I saw, so I rubbed my eyes one more time. then zoomed in on the area, hoping I was imagining things, but instead I felt completely uncomfortable. Despite the low resolution, I could see a dark silhouette with a pale blur instead of a face, where the eyes, nose, and mouth, which seemed to be abnormally large, looked like they had been outlined in ink. I was scared out of my wits, so I hurriedly closed the browser and went to bed. It was hard to fall asleep for a long time because I couldn't get that creature in the woods out of my head. I wasn't thinking of anything else at the time, except questions about how it was possible that I had seen what I had seen. I tossed and turned for another 2 hours until, at last, I fell into a sound sleep with surprisingly no dreams. In the morning, I felt slightly dizzy, but still, I drank tea and went to work. As it turned out, at night the customer had sent a new task. I spent a lot of time with it till the evening, and when I finished and opened Google Maps, I couldn't believe my eyes. The same panorama has changed again. Instead of a clear sky, there were heavy leaden clouds. The forest turned black, and the space seemed to have shrunk and become stuffy. Shivering, I slowly rotated the panorama until I froze again, forgetting how to breathe. This time, the silhouette was no longer blurred. Now it looked like a dark figure in some kind of rags, and the pale face showed clearly the dark gaps where ordinary people would have eyes and a nose, and the mouth seemed even bigger. I could no longer blame the low resolution. The creature was standing only a few meters away from me. You do remember that faces on user panoramas are almost never blurred, don't you? It was his real face. That's when I got really scared. But in spite of that, my rational thinking was still working, and I tried every way I could to explain what I was seeing. I decided to be reasonable. The creator of the panoramas might be a good graphic artist, and he could decide to make a very realistic panoramic collage with the strange creature. Clicking on the author's name, it was some incoherent set of letters that I couldn't even read. Opening the sidebar with information about him, it turned out that this last panorama was the only one. I wondered why he made 3 photos and then deleted 2 of them in less than 24 hours. Maybe I was an accidental witness to some online game? I had no idea, though there had to be a logical explanation. I didn't want to stay here any longer, so I decided to come back home. Remember my compulsive disorder? I just couldn't tell myself that I was back in Brooklyn, in my own apartment. I had to return properly, first to Anchorage, then to the Ted Stevens Airport, and from there to John F. Kennedy Airport. Actually, the real horror began in the airport of Anchorage City. First, I saw him in the crowd of people. The sensible reasoning about someone's game or an evil joke collapsed immediately because the crowd was shot by Google and their faces were blurry, except for his one. Then, I finally moved to New York. I clicked my mouse quickly, moving along Belt Parkway. On the bridge, I looked back. He was far behind me, but keeping up. Then I got to Shore Parkway, but still, I could notice him hiding behind the trees along the road. Finally, I got to my destination and closed the browser, not knowing what to do next. I can't go to the police. I didn't take screenshots, and even if I did, what would I tell them? Mr. Policeman, I was being chased by a dark figure on Google Street View. They would have taken me for a drug addict or some kind of mental patient. I gave up that idea, and after a little more staring at the monitor, finally turned off the computer. I sat at my desk, thinking about what I have just seen, about all those crowds of people, airports, and the creature I saw absolutely everywhere. It was impossible to find a rational explanation because my eyes had seen too many inexplicable things. I couldn't sleep that night. I wandered around until dawn, and only then did my eyes finally close, and I fell asleep. When I woke up at 3 p.m., ignoring the alarm clock in the morning, I slowly got out of bed, pressed the power button on my computer, and went to the kitchen. After washing my face and making coffee, I sat down at the computer again. There was also enough work today, so I did it, expecting to earn good money. It was the only thing that could distract me from goddamn Google Maps. But alas, everything has an ending. Another day was coming to an end. Having finished all the work, I accidentally went to the tab with that very panorama again, but after a few seconds, I closed it. Unfortunately, this time was enough to see what was happening on the screen. This time, it was even worse. That cozy and colorful landscape finally turned into some kind of post-apocalyptic location. The trees were almost all fallen to the ground. The pitch-black sky hung low over it, and the creature was standing right beside me. I swear to God that this time, I got a more detailed look at it. As I said earlier, the entity was dressed in some tattered, dirty black rag. This time, it was reaching out to me with its bony thin arms, and its face was covered by the same dark and tattered hood. It was enormous in height compared to what it was supposed to be. 2.5 meters tall, if not more, hovering over me. It stared straight into my soul, causing legions of goosebumps all over my body. An ingenious idea struck me shortly after I saw it. I decided to open the panorama one last time and try to take some screenshots of the creature to send them to Google support and get some explanation. I opened the history of the browser and clicked the link. However, the creature seemed to vanish from the photo. "What the hell?" I exclaimed in surprise, and with a trembling hand, I began to move my mouse around the whole panorama. Obviously, I couldn't find it anywhere. What am I supposed to do now? I was indignant. The former fear disappeared for some reason, or rather, turned into astonishment and anger. Several times I went to the same panorama, but there was no trace of the creature. That's some kind of phenomenon, I thought to myself, and continued my trip to new, interesting places. It was my last Google Panorama navigation, the navigation that turned my narrow worldview upside down, and did it several times in a row. Incredible horror took me into its arms when I saw in that damned panorama that same creature was standing in front of my house, just under the porch. I was shocked beyond measure by that image. I couldn't even move my hand to close the tab once again. Why the hell was I doing it again? Why don't I run a game instead of doing this nonsense? But even worse for me was when, through the open window, I've heard the slam of the front door. I got up from the chair, slowly approached the window, and looked out of it. There was no one at the doorway. Damn, why am I so scared? Someone might have come home and not held the door, just in case, like a freaking paranoid. I closed the door with all the available locks, and I even thought of blocking it with a small chest of drawers with a mirror. I stood in the hallway like a statue and listened to every rustle behind the door. Alas, it is old, and probably a slight blow would be enough to knock it off its hinges. The heavy footsteps echoing to the upper floors could be heard more and more clearly in the entrance hall. Come on, this can't be real. It's not happening to me, I thought, and went back to the computer. I opened the street view just next to my house, but there was no one at the door. Nevertheless, thank God no one had knocked on the door yet either. I looked out the window again. I stumbled backward in fear, tripping over the carpet and falling back. It was standing there, on the road beside the driveway. It was impossibly tall, still wearing the same black rags, which were flying like a flag in the wind. The entity lifted its head and stared at my window, right into my eyes. I was shocked. It took me a few seconds to realize that But how? How did it get here? In my godforsaken yard? That's impossible. It can't be true. It was a stupid picture on my monitor. It's just some bullshit. It's not true. I kept repeating to myself, trying to get as far away from the window as I could. But a moment later, there was another slamming of the front door and quick steps up the stairs. It was him. I'm sure of it. I'm 1,000% sure of it. The footsteps stopped on the third floor landing, right outside my apartment. I sat in the hallway as a frightened girl and heard it all well. The silence was broken by a light knock on the front door. The knocking made me shit my pants. I froze like a statue, trying not to breathe, naively believing that the creature knocking on the door would think no one was here. The knocking continued for a few more minutes, gradually escalating into more violent blows. It was these knocks that made me come to my senses and suggested to me that if I continued to stand like this, something very bad was likely to happen. Heavy blows bombarded my flimsy door, one after another, but it still held. There was nowhere to run. Jumping from the third floor was a horrible idea. I wouldn't definitely run away with all my bones broken. Panic already enveloped me nastily. I was about to get a nervous breakdown, but I held on with the last forces. After a couple of minutes, the knocking on the door suddenly stopped. As quietly as possible, I approached it and looked through the peephole. It was still there. I wasn't mistaken. The creature was standing in the stairwell, and I couldn't understand whether my neighbors hadn't heard, as someone in the night was banging on the door. It seems to be suspicious, doesn't it? I would be at least interested in what was happening there in the entrance. Maybe someone was killed or something. My thoughts were interrupted by a voice, most likely belonging to the creature. But for the first seconds, I had the impression that the voice was only in my head and not on the stairs. I couldn't make out the words, and the speech impediments were distinct and very strong. It was asking me to open the door, and that was all I could make out from what I heard. For some reason, it was then that I thought that perhaps the creature had something to do with that panorama. Therefore, the first time I began my virtual journey from here, from my house, and that's why it managed to find me. Suddenly, the banging on the door resumed. Hearing this, I rushed to the computer, reopened the street view, and frantically clicking my mouse, rushed away from my home. At the same moment, I heard and even felt as the front door fell inside the apartment, breaking the mirror attached to the drawer. I got up from the table and rushed into the hallway. The creature stood at the entrance. The same creature that I had the misfortune of seeing several times before in the panorama was now standing in all its glory on the doorstep of my apartment, but it didn't move. Suddenly, it turned its head simply to the right and stepped back. It really worked. I rejoiced and ran back to the computer. Finally, I walked away from my yard in Google Street View, and then I got away to another country. On wobbly legs, I walked out into the hallway again and looked around. Thank God, he was nowhere to be found. The last thing I heard was retreating footsteps in the entryway, followed by the slamming of the heavy metal entryway door. From that day on, I stopped doing my virtual travels. Frankly speaking, sometimes I want to open the panorama and find the explanation, but recovering those memories, I gave up this idea. Moreover, I use online maps only in case of strong necessity. I tried to forget what had happened as a terrible nightmare, but so far, I haven't managed to do it. One more thing. My neighbors really heard nothing that night. Maybe it was just my imagination.